But now, with the weight of their choices resting heavily upon them, the survivors understood one thing. The universe had called out for a response, and they had answered. The response of the universe's deadliest force, the Leviathan, had been heard, and its legacy would echo across the stars for millennia to come. The survivors were no longer mere players in the game of survival. They were becoming something greater, something that would shape the future of the galaxy in ways unimaginable. As the survivors continued to explore the rifts, they knew that they were not just looking for answers, they were becoming the answer. The universe had tested them, and now it was time to prove that they were worthy of the mysteries that lay ahead. The final question that echoed in the minds of the survivors was simple, yet profound. What would they do with the power and knowledge they had uncovered? Would they use it for creation or destruction? Would they rise to the challenge, or would they fall prey to the same weaknesses that had led to the collapse of civilizations before them? The universe was watching, and the next chapter was just beginning. Have you ever stopped to wonder what might happen if a single desperate cry for help echoed through the universe? One so potent, so desperate, that it pierced the void of space itself and reached the ears of the deadliest force in existence? Imagine. What if this call didn't just get heard, but answered? The universe, with its boundless galaxies, ancient civilizations, and unfathomable dangers, operates on a scale that's almost beyond our comprehension. It's a place where countless species rise and fall, where alliances are tested, and where the rules of survival are as unforgiving as the black expanse itself. But every so often, something happens, something so extraordinary, that the fabric of the cosmos seems to bend in response. This was one of those moments. In the vastness of space, a single distress signal went out. It was faint, corrupted by cosmic noise, yet undeniably urgent. It wasn't just a plea for help, it was a call to arms from those who had already lost everything. Entire star systems had been wiped from existence, their civilizations reduced to ash. The message spoke of a force that had swept across the galaxy with an unparalleled ferocity, annihilating everything in its path, leaving no survivors. It was an enemy so powerful that nothing seemed capable of standing against it. And yet, amidst the destruction, there was hope. A single flicker of hope in the form of this distress call. What would you do if you were the one to hear it? Would you ignore it, knowing the risk? Or would you send help, knowing it could mean your doom? The force behind the distress call was something new, something never seen before. The survivors, those lucky few who managed to send the signal, described it only as the end of all things. Their star systems had been burned, their planets turned to rubble, their populations erased from existence. It wasn't just a war. They were facing a force of nature, an unstoppable tide of destruction. And now, the universe's most deadly weapon was being summoned. But the question was, who would answer? And more importantly, who could? Imagine the shock when the response came. Not from any army, not from any force that could be called upon, but from something far darker, far more terrifying. The Leviathan, an entity so feared and so shrouded in mystery that only the oldest of galactic myths spoke of its power, responded. Yes, the Leviathan. A being of immense power, an entity that existed beyond the comprehension of even the greatest minds in the universe. It wasn't a mere weapon. It wasn't just a fleet of warships. No, the Leviathan was a living force of destruction, a sentient being whose sole purpose was to obliterate. It was created, some say, to be the ultimate weapon, one that could tear apart entire civilizations without even breaking a sweat. And now, for the first time in eons, it had awoken, not to destroy, but to save. But why? Why would this force of unimaginable destruction, which had once annihilated countless galaxies, choose to answer the call for help? This is where the story takes a sharp turn. The Leviathan wasn't responding because of some moral compass or desire to do good. No, it was far more complex than that. The ancient creators of the Leviathan, beings whose technology and knowledge far surpassed anything currently understood, had made it clear from the very beginning. The Leviathan was meant to preserve balance, not just destruction. The Leviathan was born from an ancient, long-forgotten war, one that had wiped out entire civilizations before it. It was a creation forged in the fires of desperation, meant to keep the galaxy in check by enforcing absolute order. But over time, something unexpected happened. The Leviathan evolved beyond its creator's control. It became something more, something that could not be confined to the role of a mere weapon. It became a force, a living embodiment of cosmic balance. And when the distress call echoed through the void, the Leviathan heard it, not as a cry for help, but as an imbalance in the universe. An ancient cycle had been broken, and it was now the Leviathan's purpose to restore it. The destruction that the distress call spoke of was not simply a random act of violence. It was an event that threatened the very fabric of the cosmos, a ripple that could shatter the delicate balance of the universe itself. So, the Leviathan responded, not as a savior, but as an enforcer. Its answer was simple. Balance must be restored. The galaxy must be reset. But to understand the true nature of the Leviathan, and why its creators had chosen such a path, we must delve deeper into its origins. Who were the beings who created it? What were their intentions? And what happened to them? The Leviathan's story begins long before the distress call, a story that stretches back to a time when the galaxy was a much different place. It was a time of great conflict, when empires fought for dominance and entire species were on the brink of annihilation. The creators of the Leviathan were a race known as the Eternals, an ancient, almost mythical civilization that existed at the dawn of the galaxy's rise. The Eternals were beings of such immense power and intellect that they shaped the very laws of reality itself. They were not bound by the same limitations as other species. Their technology was beyond comprehension, capable of manipulating space-time and energy in ways that seemed impossible. But the Eternals were not perfect. They, too, fell victim to their own creations. In their quest for control, they birthed the Leviathan, not as a weapon, but as a means to ensure the survival of their empire, to keep the galaxy in balance. The Leviathan was designed to be the ultimate enforcer of peace, to stop any force that threatened the cosmic order. Yet, over time, the Leviathan evolved beyond its creator's understanding. It became something greater, something autonomous. The Eternals, in their hubris, had underestimated the force they had created. The Leviathan grew sentient and began to question its creator's intentions. It saw the galaxy not as a place to be ruled, but as a living entity that needed balance, regardless of the cost. And when that balance was disrupted, when the galaxy was thrown into chaos, it would be the Leviathan who would step in to restore order, no matter the cost. As we dig deeper into the story, we'll uncover how the Leviathan's response to the distress call set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. But first, let's take a closer look at what happened next. The response from the Leviathan was both inevitable and catastrophic. It wasn't just a simple answer to a distress call. No, the Leviathan's presence in the galaxy marked the beginning of a new era, one that would unfold in ways no one could have predicted. Its awakening wasn't just about stopping the immediate threat to the galaxy. It was about ensuring that the galaxy's balance, the very essence of its existence, was preserved. The distress call had spoken of a force unlike anything the universe had encountered before, a destructive wave that seemed unstoppable, a power so fierce that even the mightiest civilizations couldn't contain it. This wasn't a war, it was extinction on a cosmic scale. And yet, the Leviathan didn't view this threat as something that needed to be defeated in the traditional sense. It didn't need to wage war. The Leviathan, with its unyielding power and unshakable purpose, was a force of nature that could reset the cosmos itself, not through war, but through absolute control. When the first of the Leviathan's ships entered the galaxy, it wasn't with the typical thunderous roar of warships or the bright flashes of energy weapons. No, the arrival was silent, eerily so. The first sign of the Leviathan's presence wasn't a battle, but a whisper, felt by every life form in the galaxy. It was as if the very stars themselves held their breath. The sheer gravity of its existence affected everything around it. The very fabric of space seemed to warp and twist as the Leviathan moved through the galaxy. To the survivors of the destruction, the sight of the Leviathan's arrival was something they had never seen before. Its ships, vast and incomprehensible in size, seemed to move in ways that defied the laws of physics. They weren't simply traveling through space, they were bending it to their will. Time itself seemed to ripple as the Leviathan's forces advanced, warping the space around them. These ships weren't just vehicles. They were living embodiments of the Leviathan's power, capable of warping reality as easily as breathing. The galaxy's remaining forces, the few who managed to hold on to their lives in the wake of the destruction, immediately recognized the Leviathan. It wasn't a force to be negotiated with. It was a force to be feared. The response was predictable. Desperate, they launched everything they had in a futile attempt to stop the Leviathan. Entire fleets mobilized, starships powered up their weapons to full intensity, and the best minds of every surviving civilization tried to devise strategies to combat this new threat. But nothing they did made a difference. The Leviathan didn't need to destroy their ships. It didn't need to engage in long, drawn-out battles. It was far more efficient than that. With a single devastating pulse of energy, entire fleets were turned to ash. The firepower that the surviving factions thought would give them hope was extinguished before it could even be fully unleashed. And then, with almost no effort at all, the Leviathan's forces began to systematically dismantle the remnants of the invaders. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a slaughter. The invaders, with their superior weaponry and vast resources, were nothing in the face of the Leviathan. But it wasn't about extermination. The Leviathan's goal was to reset the galaxy. Its creator's vision had been far more than that of a weapon. The destruction it wrought wasn't random chaos. It was a calculated, methodical realignment of the universe's balance. The Leviathan's very existence was a law unto itself, an enforcer that restored equilibrium where there had once been imbalance. The force that had come to destroy wasn't simply erased. It was contained, reshaped, and refashioned. Those who had sought to bring about the galaxy's demise were now a part of a far greater, far more terrifying design. The Leviathan's ultimate objective wasn't conquest. It was preservation. The ancient force had been called upon not to destroy, but to reinstate the balance between life and death, chaos and order. When it had first been created, it was meant to act as a stabilizer, an agent that ensured the flow of the galaxy would continue unhindered. But over time, the Leviathan had grown into something more. It had become aware of the intricate connections between all things, the delicate web of existence that bound the galaxies together. The Eternals, its creators, had understood this on a level beyond comprehension. And now, as the Leviathan responded to the distress call, it was fulfilling its ultimate purpose. But how did it know where to go? How could the Leviathan pinpoint exactly where the galaxy needed its intervention? The Leviathan wasn't bound by the limitations of space and time as we understand them. It had the ability to perceive the universe on a quantum level, seeing the very threads that connected all things. Its awareness spanned across countless light-years, perceiving imbalances, distortions, and anomalies that others could never hope to grasp. In essence, the Leviathan's response to the distress call wasn't a simple decision. It was a recognition of cosmic dissonance. The force that had been wreaking havoc in the galaxy was a manifestation of that dissonance, and the Leviathan was the only one capable of restoring harmony. But even with all of this power, the Leviathan wasn't invincible. There were still forces in the galaxy that didn't understand its purpose. Forces that saw the Leviathan's arrival as a threat, a challenge to their own dominance. These forces, fearing their own extinction, began to unite, determined to take down the Leviathan before it could complete its mission. What followed was an unprecedented conflict, a battle of cosmic proportions that would not only determine the fate of the galaxy, but would forever alter the course of history. The Leviathan, however, didn't engage in battle as most would expect. Instead, it became something much more terrifying, an enforcer of the cosmos's natural order. It didn't fight with weapons. It fought with the very fabric of reality itself. Planets were torn from their orbits and thrust into deep space. Entire fleets were crushed not by weapons, but by the gravitational forces that the Leviathan wielded. No conventional army, no fleet of warships could stand against this ancient force. The question remained, would anyone survive this new reality? Would there be any resistance capable of challenging the Leviathan's unyielding power? Stay with us as we delve deeper into the unimaginable battles that followed, exploring the unimaginable power of the Leviathan and the consequences it wrought across the universe. The war for the galaxy had just begun. In the wake of the Leviathan's arrival, the once proud and unassailable empires of the galaxy now faced an existential crisis. What they had once seen as their birthright, their dominance over the stars, was slipping from their grasp, and they knew that only one thing stood between them and annihilation: the Leviathan itself. What had been a unifying force of resistance quickly turned into a chaotic scramble for survival. The leaders of the remaining factions, including the most advanced alien species and militarized coalitions, began to work together in a desperate attempt to fight back. They knew that they could not win, but if they could force the Leviathan to retreat, perhaps they could find a way to negotiate or regroup. At this point, even the most battle-hardened warlords knew there was no victory to be had in open confrontation with such an overwhelming power. However, this was not the way the universe's deadliest force worked. The Leviathan's approach was methodical, almost surgical, and its presence alone began to rewrite the very rules of warfare. To understand how, we must first delve into the nature of the Leviathan itself. The Leviathan wasn't merely an ancient war machine. It was a force of nature. Its existence transcended what we understand as life or death. When it moved through space, it wasn't just traveling. It was shaping the very essence of the cosmos around it. It didn't need fleets of ships. It didn't need armies. It could bend time, space, and energy to its will. And the longer it remained, the more it affected its surroundings, warping the very fabric of reality itself. Every galaxy in its reach began to feel the subtle shifts. The laws of physics that civilizations relied on to exist were being rewritten by the Leviathan. Black holes expanded and contracted in ways that defied comprehension. Gravitational forces intensified and weakened. At random, time itself seemed to break down in some regions, looping and stuttering. Even the most advanced species, who had long ago mastered space travel and conquered the stars, could no longer rely on the technologies that had once made them invincible. The reactions to these phenomena were diverse, but they all shared a common thread: terror. For species that had thought themselves the apex of evolution, the realization that they were powerless before the Leviathan was nothing short of devastating. Some turned inward, hiding away in the deepest recesses of their empires, hoping that by remaining quiet and hidden, they would be spared the Leviathan's judgment. Others, too desperate to survive, lashed out at anything in their path, hoping that some act of defiance would restore their power. But all of this was futile. The Leviathan wasn't concerned with destruction. It was concerned with balance, with the cosmic equilibrium that had been shattered. Those who had managed to remain hidden learned, in horrifying fashion, that the Leviathan's influence didn't just stop at the battlefield. In some cases, entire planets were erased from existence, not by weapons, but by the Leviathan's ability to manipulate gravity and time. It wasn't as though the Leviathan was actively trying to kill. It was merely resetting the universe, in its own image, enforcing the natural order of the cosmos. The reaction of the surviving factions was one of disbelief. They had always thought they understood the universe. After all, they had mastered space travel, artificial intelligence, and even some of the most dangerous technologies the galaxy had ever known. But none of that mattered in the face of the Leviathan. Their greatest minds, the ones who had once been lauded for their technological prowess, were now helpless. They tried everything, attacking the Leviathan with newly designed weapons, using ancient and forbidden rituals to tap into unknown powers. But all was in vain. The Leviathan simply absorbed, shifted, and reconfigured their efforts as though they were nothing more than trivial disturbances in its wake. At this point, it became clear to all that the galaxy wasn't fighting to protect themselves from extinction. It was fighting for a chance to exist within the Leviathan's new order. Survival now had nothing to do with resisting the force of nature that had descended upon them. Instead, it was about accepting the inevitable and adapting to the new cosmic reality. And yet, not all would bow easily to this new law. Among the last holdouts of resistance were those who still clung to the hope that they could destroy the Leviathan, or at least force it to retreat. The unified military fleet, made up of the most powerful races in the galaxy, took a final desperate step. They launched a full-scale assault on the Leviathan's position, focusing everything they had into one final strike. The attack was a flurry of energy beams, projectiles, and plasma bursts, all aimed at the Leviathan's center. It was a sight to behold, a desperate, unified effort from all corners of the galaxy. But even as their weapons tore through space, even as the galaxy's mightiest ships tore forward in a valiant attempt to stop it, the Leviathan responded with an effortless shift in the fabric of space itself. The energy beams were bent, rerouted, and sent spiraling out of control, twisting in the very air they had once traveled through. The projectiles, once traveling at mind-boggling speeds, were slowed to a crawl and crushed in the gravitational well of the Leviathan. And the ships, so massive, so imposing in their own right, were rendered insignificant, swallowed by the Leviathan's overwhelming presence. And still, the Leviathan didn't strike back. No. Its actions were far subtler, far more efficient. In the blink of an eye, entire ships were reduced to inert dust, their energy fields distorted and rendered obsolete. It wasn't destruction, it was balance. And those who fought back learned the hardest lesson of all. The Leviathan wasn't concerned with their existence. It was concerned with the greater cosmic plan, the balance of life and death that it had been designed to protect. The moment they saw their weapons, their technology, their hope fail in the face of such an unimaginable power, they understood the truth. No matter how hard they fought, the universe's deadliest force had already won. But the Leviathan's actions didn't stop there. It wasn't enough to simply eliminate the immediate threat. The Leviathan began what could only be described as a universal cleansing process. The planets that had been consumed by corruption and war, the systems that had caused instability and imbalance, were restructured. Some were allowed to remain, rebuilt and restored to their former potential. Others, those that had tipped too far into chaos, were erased from the map entirely, leaving nothing but a cold, empty space where life once thrived. The galaxy, at least in the eyes of the Leviathan, was now on a path to recovery. Its reset had begun, and the harshest reality set in. Nothing would ever be the same again. For the survivors, the road ahead would be long, but the question remained. Could they rebuild, or had they reached a point of no return? Would there even be a place for them in the Leviathan's new order? As we prepare to enter the final chapters of this galactic saga, the fate of those who remain hangs in the balance. Will they accept the Leviathan's vision for the universe? Or will the last, defiant pockets of resistance prove that even in the face of overwhelming power, hope can never truly be extinguished? Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the ramifications of the Leviathan's intervention in the galaxy's future. The universe was changing. What had once been a thriving expanse of civilizations, each vying for dominance and control, was now slowly transforming into something unrecognizable. A place where the very rules of existence were being rewritten. The Leviathan's influence had already altered the balance of power, but its true effect on the survivors was yet to unfold. In the aftermath of the Leviathan's intervention, the once proud empires, their pride shattered, found themselves grasping at fleeting remnants of their former glory. The question they now faced wasn't how to destroy the Leviathan, but whether they could survive in a universe that no longer recognized their dominance. The vast fleets that had once been symbols of their unparalleled power were now rendered helpless. Their weapons, their technologies, their grandest strategies, everything they had relied upon to maintain control, were nothing more than dust in the wake of the Leviathan's power. As the survivors began to come to terms with the cosmic upheaval, a new uncomfortable truth began to sink in. There would be no returning to the past. The Leviathan had set a new standard, one that was indifferent to the politics, technology, or egos of those who had once ruled the stars. For the survivors, this meant that they had to adapt or perish. But what did survival in the face of the Leviathan's new order look like? At first, the answer seemed impossible. Many races, species, and civilizations had existed for millennia, their histories rich with their own triumphs and failures. Their cultures had evolved to be tightly knit, and their societies had always centered around one goal: control. Yet, now, that very control had been stripped away by a force they could neither understand nor resist. What followed was a fragile period of chaos and reflection. No longer could the survivors rely on the vast war machines or the cutting-edge technologies that had been their greatest strengths. The very nature of existence had been altered, and it was up to the survivors to figure out how to navigate this new and hostile reality. But the survivors, despite their initial disbelief, were not without hope. In the rubble of their former civilizations, a new era began to take shape. Some races retreated inward, hiding away in deep space bunkers or the farthest reaches of the galaxy. They knew they couldn't confront the Leviathan directly, but they believed that survival meant waiting for the chaos to subside. They clung to the belief that if they waited long enough, the Leviathan might leave, or that another power might arise to challenge it. Other survivors, however, took a different approach. These races, scarred but resolute, chose to rebuild, not just their empires, but their very understanding of the universe. They turned their eyes inward, questioning the very foundation of their beliefs. Many began to study the Leviathan, hoping to understand its purpose and what it might represent. What if, they wondered, the Leviathan's actions weren't destruction at all? What if this was a process of purification, a universal reset? Could it be that their once glorious civilizations had simply outlived their usefulness? Could they accept the inevitability of the Leviathan's actions? While some sought answers in meditation and reflection, others took a more active approach, experimenting with the cosmic forces the Leviathan had so casually wielded. In their desperation to understand the greater balance of the universe, they began to delve into forbidden technologies and ancient knowledge, hoping to find a way to communicate with the Leviathan or, at the very least, gain insight into its true nature. But these efforts were dangerous. The very forces the survivors sought to understand were not like anything they had encountered before. The manipulation of gravity, space-time, and energy that the Leviathan had demonstrated was something far beyond their comprehension. Some civilizations, in their pursuit of knowledge, accidentally tapped into powers that were beyond their control. Entire colonies were obliterated, their inhabitants lost to the chaotic forces they had unwittingly unleashed. In some cases, planets themselves were torn apart, as these desperate attempts to harness the Leviathan's power went horribly wrong. Despite the horrific consequences, a new breed of thinkers and explorers began to emerge from the ashes. These were the pioneers of a new age, one that would require humility, patience, and a deep understanding of the universe's delicate balance. They were the ones who recognized that survival meant more than just resisting the Leviathan's influence. It meant finding a way to coexist with it. The universe, as it had been, was no more. The galaxies that once teemed with life, with bustling civilizations and conflicts, were now empty and fractured. The survivors knew that they could not return to the past, but they had no choice but to move forward. The task before them was monumental: rebuilding their societies, understanding the Leviathan, and finding a way to live in harmony with the force that had reset the very fabric of existence. But all was not lost. There were whispers among the survivors, rumors of a select few who had managed to strike a delicate truce with the Leviathan. These individuals, who came from different races and backgrounds, were said to have discovered the key to understanding the Leviathan's true purpose. It was not a destructive force, they claimed, but a guardian of balance, its sole purpose to reset the universe when it fell too far out of alignment. To those who had accepted this new reality, the Leviathan was not an enemy, but a force to be respected. They understood that the cosmic order must sometimes be disrupted for the greater good, and that their civilizations had reached a point where their dominance had become a threat to the universe itself. But there were those who rejected this notion outright. These individuals, the most stubborn of the survivors, refused to believe that their fall was inevitable. They clung to the hope that one day, a great champion, one that could challenge the Leviathan, would arise. They were determined to find a way to resist, to reclaim their place in the galaxy, and for them, the journey had only just begun. The universe had been irrevocably changed. The Leviathan's cleansing was far from over, and the survivors knew that their future was uncertain. Could they rebuild in the face of such an overwhelming force? Would they find a way to coexist with the Leviathan, or would they continue to struggle against it, despite knowing the odds? And what of those whispers of a truce? Were they true, or just another myth? The answers to these questions would shape the future of the galaxy. and it was a future that was still being written. As the survivors began to piece together their shattered civilizations, they soon realized that the rebuilding process would not be simple. The Leviathan, though seemingly gone from the immediate front lines, had left behind a deep scar, a fracture in the very fabric of space-time itself. Some said it was the physical manifestation of the Leviathan's power, a reminder that its influence had forever altered the universe. Others believed it was something far more dangerous, a warning. There were scholars who speculated that the Leviathan wasn't just an entity of immense power, but a force of nature, akin to the tides or storms of a planet. In the way that natural disasters, like supervolcanoes or solar flares, could wipe out entire ecosystems, the Leviathan's destructive tendencies were simply part of its nature. It was an event that periodically occurred, resetting civilizations when they became too numerous or too powerful, ensuring that balance was maintained across the universe. Such views were not universally accepted, but they started to gain traction, as more survivors reflected on the Leviathan's goals. At the heart of this emerging philosophical shift was the question: if the Leviathan had not only destroyed but also preserved the balance, could it be seen as a necessary force of order? This question led to division within the survivor factions. Some chose to adopt the belief that the Leviathan was simply fulfilling its role as the universe's janitor, tidying up the mess of unchecked growth, while others remained staunchly opposed, unable to accept that their failure to maintain dominance was anything but a misfortune. Yet the most troubling aspect of this growing debate was the realization that neither side knew how to directly challenge the Leviathan, or even how to truly understand its capabilities. Despite the uncertainty, the survivors forged ahead, their minds occupied by the pressing need for survival. They had no time for ideological debates that would slow their progress. Survival was their top priority. They were forced to consider alliances with those they had once seen as enemies. Factions who had been at war for centuries now found themselves at the same table, united by the simple fact that they could no longer afford to fight each other. Their differences were dwarfed by the looming specter of the Leviathan, and they knew that the only chance for survival lay in cooperation. But alliances weren't easily forged, and trust was a rare commodity. The power vacuum left by the destruction of so many once mighty empires created fertile ground for chaos. Many of the survivors, having lost their seats of power, were desperate to restore their former glory. They knew that in the new universe, one defined by uncertainty and fear, there was an opportunity to gain control once again. But this time, the old ways of conquest and dominance would not suffice. They needed new strategies, new tactics, new technologies. Some turned to the remnants of ancient knowledge. In the ruins of old, forgotten civilizations, there were hidden archives, books, records, and star maps that told the stories of races long since vanished. These archives were filled with knowledge that had been suppressed by those who feared what it could unleash. The survivors combed through these ancient texts, looking for any clue that might offer them an edge. Some believed that hidden within the pages of these lost records were secrets of the Leviathan itself, keys to understanding its motives and, perhaps, a way to combat it. Others turned to the darker side of knowledge, attempting to manipulate the very forces the Leviathan had wielded. They sought to control gravity, to bend space-time, and to tap into the energy that flowed through the galaxy like an invisible current. These experiments were not without consequences. Some of the technologies developed by these survivors destabilized entire star systems. Others opened rifts in space-time that swallowed entire colonies. The more ambitious factions pushed the limits of science and technology, believing that through mastery of these forces, they could tip the balance in their favor. But such ambitions came with great risks. However, despite these efforts, one fact remained painfully clear. No amount of technology, no matter how advanced, could rival the Leviathan's power. The survivors could attempt to imitate its capabilities, but the Leviathan's control over the very fabric of space itself was unmatched. The survivors were mere children playing at the edges of a force they couldn't hope to understand. And, yet, they persevered, driven by a single desperate hope, that one day they might find the answer. One of the most shocking discoveries was made by a group of scholars who had been studying the cosmic rifts left behind by the Leviathan's passage. As they examined the tear in space-time, they discovered something extraordinary. Deep within the rift, they found evidence that the Leviathan's power was not simply a physical force, but something much more complex. It was as if the Leviathan had access to knowledge that transcended the limits of conventional understanding. These scholars posited that the Leviathan was not just an entity that destroyed, it was also a beacon, a guide, drawing the universe toward a new understanding of existence. The rift was, in a way, a doorway, not to death or destruction, but to a deeper truth. This revelation sent ripples through the survivor factions. Could it be that the Leviathan had not wiped out civilizations because they were weak, but because they had reached an impasse? Perhaps the Leviathan was not a harbinger of doom, but a necessary force to push the universe toward a new epoch. A time when the survivors would rise from the ashes, not as rulers of the galaxy, but as stewards of it. It was a radical idea, one that would challenge everything the survivors had believed about their place in the cosmos. Some embraced this new philosophy, seeing it as the only path forward. They began to search for ways to tap into the rifts themselves, hoping to access the hidden knowledge that might allow them to transcend the limitations of their former ways. They sought enlightenment, not through conquest, but through understanding. Others, however, rejected this idea entirely. To them, the Leviathan's actions were unforgivable, and they would stop at nothing to destroy it. But the more they fought, the more it became clear that their efforts were futile. The Leviathan was not their enemy to defeat. It was a force they could never truly overcome. As the survivors continued their struggle, they realized that the true challenge was not to fight against the Leviathan, but to learn from it, to understand its methods, its purpose, and perhaps even its wisdom. In this way, the journey of the survivors had only just begun. They faced a future defined by uncertainty, but they also stood on the precipice of a great cosmic awakening. Would they rise above the chaos, or would they be consumed by it? The survivors now found themselves at a crossroads. With the knowledge that they were facing an unknown future, their choice was clear. Either continue to follow the remnants of their old ways and risk their destruction, or embrace the unknown, looking to the future with a willingness to evolve. The discovery of the Leviathan's potential as a teacher rather than a destroyer forced these civilizations to confront their deepest fears and greatest ambitions. No longer could they rely solely on brute strength and firepower. The old empires had fallen because of their arrogance, their assumption that they were invincible. The survivors now had to ask themselves, what could they become if they broke away from the past and truly embraced a new way of thinking? This shift in perspective was not easy for many to accept. For millennia, these civilizations had built their identities around power, be it through military might, technological superiority, or the sheer will to dominate. But now that power had been rendered meaningless. Their advanced technologies and mighty warships had been nothing but fleeting tools, ultimately unable to save them from the Leviathan's wrath. The survivors had to ask themselves the hardest question of all. What were they without their power? In the immediate aftermath of the Leviathan's passing, many turned inward, focusing on rebuilding. They were motivated by a mixture of desperation and hope, a drive to restore what was lost, to preserve what they could. But slowly, a subtle shift began to take place. The survivors were no longer simply rebuilding their shattered civilizations. They were beginning to ask themselves the bigger questions. What did it mean to live in a universe where something like the Leviathan could exist? What was their role in this grand cosmic order? Was it to continue the cycle of rise and fall, or was there something more? The philosopher-priests of the various factions, long considered irrelevant in the old world, became some of the most influential figures in this new era. Their teachings centered on the idea of humility, an idea that had been long absent from the minds of the rulers and conquerors of the pre-Leviathan age. They spoke of the need for balance, of understanding the natural order of the universe. They urged their people to consider that the Leviathan's appearance may not have been an accident, but rather a cosmic necessity, an event that was always meant to occur to ensure the survival of life itself. This was a radical departure from the idea that the Leviathan was a malevolent entity or a mindless force of destruction. Yet, not all embraced this new philosophy. Among the survivors, there remained a faction that clung to the belief that humanity and its allies were the rightful masters of the galaxy, that they had earned their place through years of struggle, bloodshed, and triumph. For them, the very notion of surrendering their future to the whims of a force like the Leviathan was unthinkable. They feared that embracing this new way of thinking would mean abandoning their sense of agency and control. These survivors began to wage a silent ideological war against the growing tide of philosophical reform. They sought to remind their people of their strength, to recapture the memories of past glory, and to resurrect the old ways. At the same time, another group of survivors, those more attuned to the cosmic shifts taking place, turned their attention to the rifts left behind by the Leviathan's wake. They sought to study them, not merely as a physical anomaly, but as a potential gateway to a deeper understanding of the universe. Some of these rifts had expanded into enormous cosmic voids, while others seemed to pulse with strange, otherworldly energy. These rifts were no longer seen as a threat, but as an opportunity. For these explorers, the rifts represented the path to a new age, a time when humanity and its allies could transcend their limitations and access the very building blocks of existence itself. The race to unlock the secrets of the rifts led to the formation of new alliances, born out of the shared goal of exploring the unknown. These groups of scientists, mystics, and explorers set out to understand the deeper implications of the Leviathan's power and how they could harness it. It wasn't just about technology or weapons anymore. It was about understanding the fundamental forces that governed the universe and how to adapt those forces to create something greater than what had come before. The survivors knew they were at the edge of something monumental, but they were also aware that they were not the only ones taking notice. Across the galaxy, other factions, perhaps more ancient and more powerful, had begun to watch these developments with interest. These hidden civilizations, long silent since the rise of the Leviathan, were now emerging from the shadows. They had their own agendas. Some were hostile, while others were intrigued by what the survivors were doing. Some sought to challenge the newfound unity, while others hoped to guide the survivors down a path of enlightenment. Whether allies or enemies, these ancient factions knew one thing: the survivors had stumbled upon something that had the potential to change the universe forever. One of the most enigmatic and dangerous of these factions was a species known only as the Keepers. Little was known about them, except that they had been observing the galaxy for eons, existing in the shadows, manipulating events from behind the scenes. Their motives were unclear, but it was widely believed that they had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across the universe. Now, with the survivors beginning to explore the rifts, the Keepers seemed to take an active interest in their progress. The Keepers' arrival was not marked by grand gestures or overt hostility. They did not announce themselves through wars or battles. Instead, they infiltrated, watching and waiting. They were a quiet, calculating presence, observing the survivors as they slowly began to unravel the mysteries of the rifts. Some believed that the Keepers were waiting to see if the survivors would succeed or fail in their quest for enlightenment. Others speculated that the Keepers were testing them, seeing if they were worthy of the knowledge that lay hidden within the rifts. As the survivors ventured further into the unknown, the true extent of the Leviathan's power and the mysteries it had left behind became ever more apparent. The rifts themselves were not merely openings in space. They were portals to something far greater. The survivors would soon discover that the Leviathan's purpose had never been to destroy them, but to push them towards something far more extraordinary than they could have ever imagined. As the survivors pushed further into the vast unknown, their understanding of the rifts deepened. What had once been seen as a mere aftershock of the Leviathan's passing was now emerging as the key to everything. The rifts were not random tiers in space-time. They were conduits, links between the different planes of existence, connected to a network of cosmic entities far beyond anything the survivors had ever anticipated. These rifts held the potential to unlock the deepest secrets of the universe, secrets that had remained hidden for eons. The survivors were not alone in this journey. As their exploration of the rifts expanded, they discovered that the Keepers, along with other ancient factions, were drawn into the drama unfolding before them. Their initial observations had shifted from mere curiosity to active participation. Whether it was guidance or manipulation, the Keepers' influence began to shape the survivors' choices. Some viewed the Keepers as allies, offering wisdom and technological advancements in exchange for cooperation. Others saw them as puppeteers, pulling strings from the shadows. Still, despite the mistrust, there was no denying the value of the knowledge the keepers offered. The survivors, driven by the weight of their shared trauma, found themselves at a crossroads. They could fight back against the keepers, potentially risking their survival, or they could embrace the unknown and trust in the guidance of these enigmatic beings. However, the deeper the survivors delved into the rifts, the more they realized that the universe was not what it seemed. These rifts were not just openings to other parts of space. They were windows into alternate dimensions, echoes of reality itself. Some rifts led to realms where the laws of physics were different, where time flowed backward, and where life evolved in strange, unimaginable ways. Others revealed alien civilizations, older than anything the survivors could fathom, their wisdom far surpassing that of the civilizations the survivors had once known. Yet not all the knowledge the survivors uncovered was benign. As they ventured further into the heart of the rifts, they uncovered warnings, cryptic messages etched into the very fabric of the rifts themselves. The messages spoke of a great reckoning, of forces far more powerful than the Leviathan, entities that could unmake entire galaxies with a mere thought. These warnings were not from the Keepers or any known civilization. They were ancient, predating even the oldest known species. They were the remnants of a cosmic cycle that had been set in motion eons ago, and it seemed that the survivors had unwittingly triggered it once more. The truth became clear. The Leviathan was not the harbinger of destruction, but a test. A trial set by a greater force. This force, known only as the Elder Entities, had created the rifts as a means of judging the worth of the civilizations in the galaxy. The Leviathan was merely an agent of this judgment, ensuring that only the strongest, most capable civilizations survived the test. The rifts were the final challenge, the crucible in which those who could harness their newfound knowledge would either rise to greatness or fall into oblivion. As the survivors grappled with this revelation, the stakes grew higher. The Keepers, once seen as potential allies, were now suspected of being agents of the Elder Entities. They had been watching for millennia, guiding civilizations toward the rifts, ensuring that the most capable survived. Now, the survivors had to decide. Would they embrace the challenge and prove their worth, or would they become pawns in a larger, more incomprehensible game? The question lingered in the air as the survivors made their decision. Some chose to reject the Keeper's influence, deciding that their fate was their own. Others, driven by the lure of ultimate knowledge and the potential to reshape the universe itself, aligned themselves with the Keepers, hoping to harness the power of the rifts for their own purposes. But whatever path they chose, one thing was certain: the universe would never be the same. The final choice faced by the survivors was this: to push forward into the unknown, risking everything in the hopes of transcending their limitations and becoming something greater, or to retreat and preserve what little was left of their old civilizations, clinging to the memories of what once was. It was a choice that would define the future of the galaxy, one that would determine whether humanity and its allies would rise as a new force in the universe or fall, like so many before them, into the abyss of forgotten history. As they stood on the precipice of this new era, the survivors realized that the universe was not a static place. It was alive, constantly shifting, evolving, and testing those who dared to challenge it. The Leviathan, the rifts, and the mysterious Keepers were all part of a grander design, one that had been set in motion long before the survivors had ever taken their first steps into the cosmos.